This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
With Pakistan mired in political turmoil, suicide bombers have struck yet again. This time, the victims were commuters rushing to work in the city of Rawalindi near the capital Islamabad.
The attack's right in the heart of Pakistan military's own backyard. The armed forces is headquartered at Rawalpindi and is an area with the tightest security in the country. At least 24 are so far confirmed to have died. Al Jazeera's Islamabad correspondent Kamal Haider reports.
High alert declared in Rawalpindi after two suicide attacks early on Tuesday. The bomb blasts, less than 10 minutes apart, were well organized and lethal. The first hit ordinary commuters while the second ripped through a bus carrying Ministry of Defense employees. Two simultaneous attacks in the city of Rawalpindi, one attack taking place in a bazaar, the other attack apparently targeting a bus carrying Ministry of Defense officials in a sensitive area of the city surrounded by vital offices of the military. At this moment you can see the staff of the forensics department and explosive experts working and sifting through the area. Rawalpindi is an important garrison city on the outskirts of Islamabad and also home to headquarters of the army, known as the GHQ. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for the explosions and there was swift public condemnation.
We condemn this terrorism. These people cannot be Muslims. This is a good and peaceful area. We felt safe as the GHQ is here.
Officials said it is too early to say who was responsible for the blasts.
It can be anybody. There are so many anti-state elements and agencies working.
The country has recently seen an upsurge in attacks targeting security and military personnel. The latest attack comes just days before the return of Pakistan's exiled former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and just months before the general elections. The incident here will add further tension to an already worried population. Kamal Haider, Al Jazeera, Islamabad.
رفض الرئيس الباكستاني برويز مشرف اليوم مهلة مدتها يومان.
The Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf refused to respond to a power-sharing offer by his exiled rival Benazir Bhutto. Musharraf's spokesman said that the president will put national interests above everything and that he will do everything according to the constitution and in a timely fashion. Meanwhile, Bhutto said that Musharraf had agreed to drop the charges of corruption against her, her husband, and a dozen other legislators in the form of a general amnesty covering 1988 to 1999.
في عفو عام يغطي المدة بين 88 و 99 من القرن الماضي.
There are increasing talks about an agreement in which Musharraf gets the support of Bhutto and her party to run for another term in office in return for pardoning her and allowing her to become the prime minister after the legislative elections. The talks about this agreement have impacted the political climate in Pakistan. The government and the president's supporters acknowledge that negotiations between the two sides have progressed, but they also have said that the ruling party is currently facing major problems. Many members within the ruling party are not willing to accept such an agreement and warn that the party might be split over it.
Of course, there will be some frictions.
Of course, there will be some frictions within the ruling party, but only a small group will leave. This will be the ideal time for this to happen. But I think that things will go well and the president will be re-elected.
These fears were increased by statements made by officials closely associated with the exiled former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. They said that some members of the ruling party have contacted the exiled Prime Minister and offered to join him once he returns to the country. This poses a political challenge to the current President Pervez Musharraf, since he may no longer maintain majority at the parliament, which he needs to amend the constitution so that he can stay in office for a second term. Some political analysts believe that this leaves Musharraf with only one alternative, which is an honorable resignation.
I believe that the time has come for President Musharraf to realize he can no longer stay in office for a second term. If he were to comply with the Constitution, then he should resign. The judicial system has effectively started to play its role as the guardian of the Constitution. The resignation of the president would give him some kind of credibility and would allow him to get out of the crisis in an honorable way.
During the negotiations, Bhutto and her supporters put the ball in Musharraf's court by announcing that Pakistan People's Party, the PPP, will not support him in the coming elections unless he gives up his military position and other authorities.
That PPP will never...
We have made it very clear that the PPP will never accept a military commander as president. Moreover, attempts by the president to get re-elected by the current parliament is contrary to the Constitution, and we will challenge him in court. Musharraf must give up some of his authorities and return those authorities to the Prime Minister's office.
Pakistani opponents continue to meet despite their different views, because it seems that all of them do not want their common enemy to win in the next elections. The former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto is taking advantage of the fact that General Pervez Musharraf is running out of options. Her aim is to increase pressure on him because she knows that the Constitution leaves him with limited options. For Al Madar program, Jamal Ismail, Abu Dhabi, Islamabad.
The Lebanese army continues building shelters and clearing the Nar al-Barid refugee camp of landmines. The following report shows Abu Ammar's bunker and the body of Abu Salem Taha after it was pulled from the beach. More details in the report of my colleague Abu Malik Sharif.
For those of you who don't know, we are in Abu Ammar's bunker. Many stories have been told about this bunker, but now you can see it with your own eyes. Everything in the bunker remains untouched. The weapons were left here, and the huge quantities of food supplies were not removed. There was a lot of canned goods, tuna, sardines, and corn, and water bottles, as well as boxes of bullets, mortar shells, and missiles. The smell of death is everywhere inside. Every path leads to an exit. One of the lighted exits leads to a home in the Al-Qadamiyya neighborhood. Then we went to the coast to see what used to be known as the Han area. There were many shelters, which were used as bases by the armed members of Fatah al-Islam. We received information that Fatah al-Islam's leader, Shakar Al-Absi, was killed here as he was trying to get outside. To the right of this location, one finds the waterfront. The schools that were run by the United Nations Refugees and Workers Agency, UNRWA, no longer look like schools. Then we located the body of Abu Salem Taha, the spokesman of Fatah al-Islam. DNA tests were made in the Tripoli hospital to identify his body. Abu Salem Taha is a Palestinian national who lived in Syria. His real name is Mohammed Zaweh. He is married to a Lebanese woman from Tripoli. During the night, there were exchanges of fire between the Lebanese army and remnants of Fatah al-Islam. In the morning, 7 bodies were pulled out, and the army continued combing the area and burning tunnels. About 4 to 9 terrorists are now hiding in the town of Benin. The army is trying to locate them with the support of the local population. This is an image of what is going on in the Nar al-Barid refugee camp. In al-Badawi area, however, another battle has just begun. The refugees who were displaced from Nar al-Barid refugee camp organized a demonstration demanding that the Lebanese government arrange their return in an organized manner and as soon as possible. They demonstrated against possible plans to wipe out Nar al-Barid refugee camp from the map.
We want to return quickly to Nahr al-Barid refugee camp. We want the Palestinian organizations and the Lebanese government to contribute in the reconstruction of the refugee camp because it's a symbol for the Palestinian resistance and the struggle to return to their home.
Some of the protesters, especially the older women, had nervous breakdowns and lost consciousness. Only a few kilometers separate Nar al-Bared refugee camp and al-Badawi area. The battle in Nar al-Bared ended, but another one may soon begin in al-Badawi area by the displaced Palestinian refugees if they are not quickly allowed to return to their refugee camp.
After 3 months of intense fighting, the ordeal is finally over. The Lebanese army finished off the Fatah al-Islam legend. They killed its leader, Al-Absi, as well as 37 other terrorists, and rounded up 20 on the 106th day of the confrontation at the northern refugee camp of Nahr al-Bared. Army Commander Michel Sleiman hailed the army's crushing victory in seizing control of the refugee camp from the Islamist extremists as a move which scored victory over terrorism and which could cement unity in Lebanon. May Fawaz reports.
After more than 3 months of fighting, Lebanese troops finally seized control on Sunday of the Nahr al-Bared Palestinian refugee camp from Fatah al-Islam militants. Thousands of people converged on Nahr al-Bared after news broke in the late afternoon that the army had overrun the camp, as troops fired celebratory volleys into the air and flashed the V for victory sign. Following a siege of more than 3 months, Nahr al-Bared fell to a mass assault after troops killed at least 37 Islamist militants, making a desperate pre-dawn attempt to break the siege. An army source told AFP that the head of Fatah al-Islam, Al-Absi, was among the dead and that his wife identified his body at a hospital in Tripoli. Absi's daughter also identified the body of Fatah Islam spokesman Abu Salim Taha. Another 15 Fatah Islam fighters were captured, some of whom managed to reach nearby villages before being caught in the manhunt as troops searched roofs and nearby fields. A security source added that 9 wounded militants were evacuated by the army after they were found in underground shelters in the ruined camp. The army said the final assault on Nahr al-Bared began at about 3:30 a.m. after the militants attempted to break out on 3 fronts, including by sea, but most were killed or captured. In their pre-dawn breakout attempt, the militants also had help from outside. A Mercedes car pulled up at an army checkpoint on the eastern edge of the camp and began at soldiers as fighters launched an attack from inside. Militants attacked another checkpoint at the same time. A source said 3 people in the Mercedes were killed. The white vehicle was later seen being towed away. The army cordoned off the area and closed the nearby road linking Tripoli to Syria. Nahr al-Bared was home to some 31,000 Palestinian refugees, most of whom fled in the early days of the standoff and have since been housed at the nearby camp of Badawi. The army urged the refugees not to seek to return to Nahr al-Bared until they received the all-clear. More than 220 people, including 158 Lebanese troops, were killed during the standoff, which started on May 20th near the sprawling camp outside Tripoli. 3 soldiers died in Sunday's fighting.
Al-Absi, a name linked to terrorism with a history marred with crimes. The Fatah al-Islam leader moved from Jordan, Libya, Syria, and then to Lebanon. Here's a brief on his life.
He is a Palestinian refugee with a battle-hardened and globe-trotting past. He is Al-Absi. Born in the Ain al-Sultan refugee camp near the West Bank town of Jericho in 1955, Absi fled with his family to Jordan after Israel occupied the West Bank in the 1967 war. In 1976, Absi moved to Tunisia to study medicine with his tuition paid by the Fatah movement. Al-Absi left medical school and went back to Amman to fight Israeli forces. He was sent to Libya to join the military school. He graduated as a sergeant military pilot in 1967. In the 1980s, Absi served in the secular Palestine Liberation Organization, flew Mi fighter jets for Libya in its war with Chad, and fought Israeli forces which invaded Lebanon to drive out the PLO. But later, Absi turned to radical Islam out of both religious convictions and frustration over the failure of the Palestinian cause. Shakir al-Absi remained in Libya until 1993, then he moved to Syria. In 2002, however, he was charged for smuggling weapons and was jailed for 3 years. During his 3 years in jail, a Jordanian court sentenced him to death in his absence for having taken part in organizing the 2002 assassination in Amman of U.S. diplomat Lawrence Foley. Released in 2005, he left for Lebanon, where he was an activist leader for the Fatah Intifada group, which was close to Syria, in the Palestinian refugee camp of Shatila in Beirut. He then moved to another camp in Qusayya in the western Bekaa, where he trained the group known as Fatah al-Islam.
ربما تكون الزيارة الأخيرة لجورج بوش إلى العراق خلال ما تبقى من ولايته.
Bush's visit to Iraq could be his last during his remaining time in office. Bush, who was accompanied by his Secretaries of State and Defense and his National Security Advisor, wanted to stress the importance of his visit. However, the timing of his visit raises several questions. It came just 2 weeks before the head of the U.S. military in Iraq, David Petraeus, and the U.S. Ambassador Crocker submit a joint report on Iraq's security progress, which may decide Bush's next strategy in Iraq. His visit also comes as the U.S. Democrats in Congress intensified their campaign against the Bush administration's policies in Iraq. The showdown between Bush and the Democrats intensified after the latter rejected a Bush proposal calling for the increase of military funding in Iraq and Afghanistan in the amount of $50 billion. Bush's visit also comes at a time when the Democrats and the Republicans continue to promote their political campaigns as the countdown for the presidential elections is underway. It also comes after the U.S. administration, including the president himself, strongly criticized the Iraqi government and Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. What was the purpose of Bush's visit to Iraq? Did it have something to do with the political situation in Washington or the political process in Iraq?
هل أهداف الزيارة أمريكية داخلية بحتة أم تتعلق أيضا بالعملية السياسية في العراق؟
President Bush's visit to Iraq has raised many questions, including his choice of the Al-Asad air base in the Anbar province as his final destination. By arriving at the predominantly Sunni Anbar province, Bush wanted to send a message to Nouri al-Maliki and the leaders of the so-called moderate front, which have excluded the Sunni blocs. The Bush administration believes that the Anbar province, which has witnessed security progress, is a good model for the rest of the country. This news comes after local tribes in the Anbar province joined the army and took part in the fight against al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the head of the U.S. military in Iraq, David Petraeus, and the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad, Ryan Crocker, continue to lay down the groundwork for their security progress report on Iraq. This report intends to assess the country's security situation, which has become the focus of debate between the Bush administration and Congress. The Democrats have repeatedly called for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq, where the death toll among the U.S. military has exceeded 3,700. During his visit, Bush was accompanied with his top senior officials, including Secretary of State and Defense and his National Security Advisor. In a session described as his last meeting before he decides on his upcoming strategy during the next 2 weeks, Bush met with Iraqi and tribal leaders. Bush's last visit to Iraq was a year ago, when he met with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who then had a good relationship with Washington. However, time has changed, and today's visit came amidst a political showdown between Washington and the al-Maliki government. Both Washington and Baghdad have blamed one another for the slow progress in the country's political process and the delay in the implementation of its national reconciliation. Zain al-Fayez, Al-Arabiya.
We are now joined from Washington by Hisham Melhem, a U.S. military analyst. What kind of political impact will the Bush visit have at the U.S. national level? What are the main advantages of this visit?
Of course, the Bush visit has implications at both the Iraqi and American national levels. This was rather obvious in Bush's statements, which also included an implied message to the central government in Baghdad, as well as to the local tribal and Sunni leaders in the Anbar province. Bush also sent an implied message to his critics in Congress. In addition, Bush wanted to convey a message to the central government in Baghdad that it must take advantage of the security progress made in the country and work to create political and economic reforms in order to improve the living conditions of the Iraqi people, including the residents in the Anbar province. He also wanted to convey a message to local tribal leaders in the Anbar province that their cooperation with the U.S. military will lead to improving the security, economic, and political situations there. Moreover, Bush wanted to tell his critics in Congress that his security plan in Iraq must remain in effect until next spring in order to achieve progress in the political situation in the country. Then he will order a partial withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq, especially if the security situation continues to improve. However, Bush warned that any withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq will be based on a military assessment of the security situation on the ground, and it will not be based on any political or election considerations.
The British Prime Minister Gordon Brown said the final withdrawal of British troops from the city of Basra is not a defeat. Brown's statements came a few hours after the withdrawal of British forces from the presidential palaces in the center of the city. The withdrawal of these forces followed the withdrawal of an estimated 5,000 soldiers who are deployed at the Basra airport located outside of the city. At a press conference, Brown confirmed that with this step, the British forces have been changed from having a fighting role to a monitoring and training role.
To the city of Basra in southern Iraq, this is the sun of freedom. However, to the American occupation, it is nothing more than the sun setting on the coalition. The British occupation, which is the largest ally of the invasion of Iraq, withdrew its forces from its last position in the center of the city. This step received widespread political support in Britain. However, it risks being met by the anger of Washington, which is making efforts to increase the number of its forces. The withdrawal of the Basra Palace came 1 year after a similar withdrawal from 3 other bases. The 500 troops will join 5,000 others who are deployed at the Basra airport base outside the city. With this, the British forces will distance themselves from almost daily mortar shell and missile attacks that often resulted in human casualties. 268 British soldiers have been killed since the invasion of Iraq. The Iraqi forces confirmed that it has taken over the Basra Palace, indicating that it is a functional city, except for the attacks carried out by the resistance against the occupation.
Everyone must know that 1 week ago the Iraqi forces have taken complete control over the presidential palaces. We asked the brothers who carried out military operations against the British to pay attention, because now your brothers are in the palaces.
Contrary to what was said about how the withdrawal of occupation forces would result in a security vacuum, the Iraqi public said it is confident in its forces' ability to control the situation.
The withdrawal of the British forces from the presidential palaces has not led to a vacuum in this area. Rather, our police and army forces are perfectly capable to perform its duties in the best way.
انسحاب ينظر إليه على أنه يمهد الانسحاب النهائي قد يكتمل بحلول نهاية. Amidst an escalated exchange of accusations between former American and British generals over the Iraq War, this withdrawal is seen as paving the way for a final withdrawal, which may be completed by the end of the year. There is the question of whether this withdrawal was something good for the British government before the upcoming general elections. According to observers, this decision certainly doesn't hide the fact that the withdrawal was a blow to the U.S.-British coalition, which may affect London and Washington's relations at a high level. It will force the latter to think twice before taking any future steps.
Palestinian ambulances turn towards occupied Jerusalem only in cases of emergency, but emergencies are bound in the West Bank and Gaza. 70% of ambulances transporting patients were held up at checkpoints in the first 6 months of the year, making the ambulances change their final destination to hospitals in the West Bank. The story with our reporter Mohammed Sayed from occupied Jerusalem.
During the Intifada, ambulance vehicles in the Palestinian territories received the largest share of attacks by the occupying forces against the Palestinian people. Some ambulances were prevented from transporting the injured, some were destroyed, and others had their passengers killed.
Ambulances are held up intentionally and systematically on the pretext of keeping order and regulating patients' entry.
Today, due to the barriers at the entrance of each village and city, suffering is prevalent, especially with critical cases that require transporting the patients from the West Bank and Gaza to hospitals in occupied Jerusalem.
A patient goes through many passageways, then they take his photo on this machine, and then it's on to inspections.
They might forbid us from entering. All of the attendants accompanying me were not allowed in. I came in alone.
According to a petition by Physicians for Human Rights, in 2007, the number of ambulances that were either prohibited from entering Jerusalem or were held up for hours at checkpoints was over 70%.
Only 5 cars from the Palestinian Red Cross are allowed to go into Jerusalem, and only after coordinating in advance with the occupation forces. This means that a person who needs emergency care first needs to make arrangements before receiving it.
The suffering of the Palestinians does not stop at the sieges that transform the towns and villages into large prisons. It also extends to the sick that are deprived of their right to pass through the checkpoints in ambulances, at times paying the price with their own lives. Muhammad Al-Saeed, Dubai TV, Al-Maqasid Hospital, occupied Jerusalem.
Hi, I'm Jamal Dajani, producer of the show you've just been watching. I'm here to tell you that thanks to viewers like you, we've already raised over 10% of our Mosaic fundraising goal. We are getting closer to keeping Mosaic on the air for the rest of the year. However, we still have a long way to go to keep this kind of reporting free and uncensored on Link TV. Over the past few days, you've heard from some of our biggest supporters, people like Amy Goodman, Dr. James Zogby, and Sandeep Roy. They came out because they believe in what Mosaic brings. Now we're asking you to do your part. Call 1-866-485-8848 and make your donation today. Or go to linktv.org and just click on the support button. Every donation makes a difference. For a $200 donation, we can continue to send you one more show online and by podcast. For a $400 donation, we can produce another Mosaic Intelligence Report. Or for a very generous tax-deductible $1,000 donation, you can join the Mosaic Producer Circle. You'll get to tour the studios, meet the staff, and see firsthand how this Peabody Award-winning show is made. Pick up that phone and call 1-866-485-8848 or go online to linktv.org. We need to hear from you before the summer is over to keep Mosaic going. I'm confident that with your support, we will reach our goal. Mosaic simply cannot happen anywhere else. I have made more than 1,400 episodes of Mosaic and never had to censor anything because of threats from advertisers, corporate underwriters, or the administration. That's because at Link TV, the bottom line is you, the viewer. Mosaic represents freedom of speech, the power of information, and access to uncensored news. In this time of war, these things are needed more than ever. Call Link TV now at 1-866-485-8848. Go to linktv.org. Thank you for your commitment and for making Mosaic part of your life.
Mosaic needs your support. Help us reach our goal to raise $200,000 by the end of the year to keep Mosaic on the air. Pledge your gift today at 1-866-485-8848 or linktv.org. Get more news about the Middle East online at linktv.org/Mosaic. The Mosaic webpage offers a complete archive of Mosaic programs, program transcripts, the Mosaic Video Podcast, and the Mosaic Intelligence Report, a weekly analysis of the hottest stories from the Middle East. The views expressed on Mosaic are those of the participating broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible with the support of viewers like you. Thank you. This program was brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. television network devoted to global and national news, with uncompromising documentaries and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.